Everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the land on which we gather today here at UBC Okanagan is the Syilx Okanagan Nation and their people, their unceded territory. And we're especially appreciative to be here today because it's a beautiful sunny spring day here, and I hope it's also sunny where you are. We're delighted to have people joining us from across the region, so thank you very much. My name is Joan Batorf. I'm a professor here in the School of Nursing at UBC Okanagan and director of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention. And we're particularly delighted to bring this session to you today. And as you can see today, we're entirely online. In most part because of the social distancing requirements. So thank you for participating with us today online. We will have time for questions and comments at the end, and you will see a little chat box in the corner of your screen. And if you put those questions and comments in the box, we can read them out to our speaker. So I'm going to begin by introducing Brian Dalton, my colleague here at UBC Okanagan. Dr. Dalton leads the Sensory Motor Physiological Integrative Neuromechanics Lab. I love the SPIN acronym. It's great. Here in the School of Health and Exercise Science. And he's here to talk to us about healthy aging and balance. Where do we stand? So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joan. So thanks everyone for joining online here. So what I want to talk to you today is where we're going to talk to you about adult aging and balance control. And how I'm going to start is I'll go in and talk about some of the changes that happen with adult aging, and then we'll move on and talk a little bit about how we maintain healthy aging and function, and lead off or end off with looking at balance control. So let's see if I can get my slides to change. Here we go. So today's population is increasingly getting older, and seniors make up a large proportion of our population. And it seems, if we look at the figure here on the bottom, that older adults make up about 4 times the cost of healthcare related spending compared to younger adults, of people in their 20s. So we need to figure out how we can manage these costs and find out what's happening with aging leading to these costs. So some other points here is that for the first time in history, older adults above the age of 65 are now relatively outnumber the number of people that are less than 14 years of age. And for some reason, this age discrepancy is much larger in British Columbia, as well as my original, or my hometown of Newfoundland, my home province of Newfoundland. So there's something going on in Canada, at least on the West Coast and the East Coast, whereby our generations are getting older. And here on the left of the slides, I have a couple of images of the Okanagan, as well as on the left bottom part of our screen here, I have an image of my hometown, Bonavista, to give you an idea of the scenery there as well. So the question then is, what causes aging? and how can we slow it down? Well, if we look at this graph here, it's a simple relationship. So the number of years by the number of birthdays, that will lead us to getting older. So all we need to do is stop having birthdays. But there's more to it than that. So there's the idea of chronological aging, whereby it's the number of years that we're alive, versus the idea of biological aging, whereby it's not a linear process. And it seems that, or as we know, or we can see in the world, that people appear to age at different rates. Here on our slide, if we look at the lower right-hand corner, we see that we have a couple people here who are quite healthy and they're participating at high levels of activity. Whereas people of the same age on the left side, they have some impairments and some disturbances to their function. So my interest is, how can we prevent those people with the disabilities? How can we move them over and get them closer to those that are quite active and able to live these healthy lifestyles? And before I go any further, I want to talk about the differences of types of aging. One is the chronological age, so it's the years since you were born. Then we have biological age, and this is determined by your biological profile, or your genetics for short. And then there's this functional age. And the functional age is where we are determining your age based on your functional performance. And that's where a lot of my work will reside, where we're trying to ensure that older adults are maintaining function for independent living so that they can maintain their strength and power, as well as maintain balance control so that they can maintain function. And another way to look at it is where we're trying to crack the code, so to speak, trying to figure out what mechanisms are responsible for declines in functional aging and how can we maintain a low functional age or a young functional age. Now, with adult aging, there are some general observations, and this is a slide that I've been using throughout the years. On the left, we have a runner who, at the time the picture was taken, was the world champion in a sprinting event. And then on the right, we have an older individual who was also the world champion in a sprinting event. But we can see that the person on the right has lost more muscle mass or is quite smaller than the person on the left. Some other general observations with age then is that if you saw Alex Yakujan's talk from last week, she would have talked a bit about healthy adult aging and fatigue, whereby older adults may fatigue less during isometric contractions. But during dynamic tasks like walking up the stairs or going for runs, older adults seem to fatigue more. As well, from the picture below, we see that older adults have a loss of muscle mass, and there's also decreased cognitive function. So it seems like thinking about things take a little longer. and movements are slower, as well as we're experiencing muscle weakness. And what I'm interested in, there's also a loss of balance control. So older adults seem to sway more and they have difficulty in responding to perturbations, for example, when they trip. Now, I know I'm talking about a lot of negative things here, so just bear with me and I'll get to some of the good parts in a second or in a few minutes. So with the effect of adult aging, a lot of our body's systems also become impaired. So we have decreases in our skeletal system, so our bone mineral density starts to decline. Our nervous system also begins to decline. And as well, we have decreases in our heart and circulatory system as well as respiratory system. And as I talked about earlier, then we also have decreases in muscle mass or our muscles' ability to perform. So you keep saying, or I keep saying, there's a lot of decreases with age. Well, one thing we can count on, or one increase we can count on, is that there's an increase in fat mass or an increase in blood pressure and disease. When we talk about the neuromuscular system, we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves that innervate the muscles. And this is what I'm very interested in. I'm interested in how the brain sends signals through the spinal cord to the muscles to be able to activate our muscles and perform functional tasks such as balance control. And what is the cornerstone of this neuromuscular system is the motor unit. And the motor unit is these small nerves here. If you look at the bottom figure on our screen, it's a cross section of a spinal cord, and we have these nerves innervating the muscle. The motor unit is these motor nerves that innervate muscle fibers, and they control the signals from our brain going to our muscles, and they may be the limiting factor that causes our brain to be able to activate our muscles. Now, one thing that happens with adult aging is sarcopenia. And taken down into its definition, it means poverty of the flesh. And in the literature, what it's looking at is a loss of muscle mass, and which leads to decreases in strength and power. And this decrease in strength and power is associated with biological aging. And with decreases in strength and power, we also have decreases in function. And what I'm concerned about is now, is this an obligatory action or from aging, or can we prevent this or maintain function into old age? And what people have been thinking is that sarcopenia may be the biggest feature of adult aging that limits function. As one person said, there may be no single feature of age-related decline more striking than the age decline in lean body mass. So it's pretty striking. It's very observational. We can see the difference between healthy young adults and older adults, that we have this decrease in muscle mass. And then with adult aging, we kind of throw all these things together and we can see these reductions. And if we throw them all together, it ends up being a loss of functional independence. So we need to figure out ways that we can maintain functional independence. So in this example I have here, we have a funnel and we're throwing in the changes with adult aging, such as slowed movements or slowed muscle contractile speed, as well as reductions in strength and reductions in power. And this will then lead to a loss of functional independence. And what I mean when I'm talking about functional independence, I'll show you on this figure. So on the y-axis, we have strength, and on the x-axis, we have age in years. And as we're aging, our strength begins to decline and we get closer to this functional threshold. And what we want to do is we want to stay above this functional threshold as much or as long as possible. The closer we get to this functional threshold as we age means that we're working at a higher percentage of our max capacity of our system. So when we go to perform a task, we increase the risk of tripping or falling, or we increase the risk of having limited function. So the closer we get to this functional threshold, the worse it is, or the more difficult it is for us to perform functional tasks of daily living. So what we need to do is we need to focus on these functional thresholds and hopefully design protocols such that we can stay above these functional thresholds so that we can perform physical tasks and maintain independence throughout the lifespan. Here I have a somewhat complicated figure, but this just shows you that it's not just one factor that leads to sarcopenia or decreases in the neuromuscular system with age. There are multi-factors, or it's multifactorial, that we have these decreases. And over here on the left, the motor neurons and motor units, that's where I'm focused on. I'm trying to figure out what's happening with these parts of the system and how they change. But there are other factors such as hormonal factors, lifestyle changes, immunological factors, and others that will also lead to decreases with adult aging. Now, to get back to it, how our neuromuscular system ages is it's dependent on this motor unit that I talked about earlier. And the motor unit is the basic contractile unit, the basic unit or gatekeeper of signals from our brain going to our muscles. And it is the motor nerve and the muscle fibers that it innervates. And based on this motor unit, it limits how strong we are, as well as it is correlated to our muscle strength and muscle power. And what the motor unit does is that it sends these electrical signals from the brain to the muscles that tell it to contract. So again, it is a likely limiting factor in our ability to produce force or produce power so that we can walk upstairs or go for a run or get ourselves out of a chair. Underlying adult aging is this idea of age-related remodeling. And again, last week, Alex Yakashen talked a little bit about this idea. So what happens to the motor unit with adult aging? We have an example on the bottom here of two motor units, so two muscle nerves, and they're innervating their muscle fibers. So the dark muscle fibers and the light muscle fibers. And then next to that, we have a circle, which is the cross section of the muscle, showing the dark muscle fibers that belong to motor unit 1 and the white muscle fibers that belong to motor unit 2. As we age, we have death of some of these motor nerves. Now, one of these nerves has died and it has orphaned the white muscle fibers. So now there's no innervation. In order for us to have survival of these muscle fibers, the surviving motor nerve must re-innervate the orphaned muscle fibers. So in this example, we have the surviving motor nerve innervating the white muscle fibers so that we can see here they change color. So now they all belong to one motor unit. So as we age, our motor units increase the number of muscle fibers that they innervate, and they get larger. But unfortunately, some of these muscle fibers, as we see in the cross section in the circle here, there are a couple white muscle fibers that didn't get innervated. So they will die off. And that's what's leading to now our decreases in muscle size, as well as decreases in strength. Other things that happen with age are we have these reductions in muscle mass. We also have these increases in non-contractile tissue. So if we're looking at a muscle, and I have an image of a muscle here on the screen, and on the left side, it kind of looks like this steak or pork chop. But what it is, it's a cross section. It's a cross section of the muscle, and we're looking top down at the muscle. And we can see the dark regions here is the muscle, and the white is non-contractile tissue or fat and bone. What we see then, as we have a healthy young adult on the left, on the right we have an older adult. And we see that the muscle is smaller, as well as it has more of this white tissue amongst the muscle, meaning that there's greater increases in non-contractile tissue. As well, with age, our tendons increase their compliance, so they're not as stiff as healthy young adults. And there's also reductions in specific strength or power. So the amount of force a single muscle fiber can produce is much less in an older adult than a younger adult. All right, so just bear with me for a second here. Now I'm almost done with the negative aspects of aging, and I'll go into some more positive things in a second. With adult aging, we know that the number of motor units decreases with age. And on the slide here, I have examples of various muscles that decrease roughly between 40 and 60% from people in their 20s and 30s to those in their 60s and 80s. So there's roughly a 40 to 60% decline. However, this is not a generalization to all muscles. What we found about 10 years ago now is that the soleus muscle, which is the muscle at the back of your leg or one of your calf muscles that is very important for balance control, as well as propelling you during walking, allows you to push your toes into the ground. The soleus is not significantly different in young adults versus old adults. So it's maintained more in healthy older adults. In recreationally active older adults, the soleus maintains its motor units compared to the young adult. So that led us to a question: are these motor units being maintained because of lifelong activity, chronic activity, or habitual activity? The soleus, we know, is involved in standing balance, and it's the most active muscle in our limbs, in the limbs of humans. So that led us to looking at research in the animal populations. And what happened when we reviewed the literature, one study looked at endurance swimming in mice. So what they did was they had these mice swim in a pool, I think 3 times a week for a long duration. And what happened when they tested the motor units of these animals, the animals who were physically active maintained their motor units better than age-matched controls. So old mice were able to maintain their motor units through physical activity. So we transferred this to a healthy population in humans. So we looked at masters athletes in older adults. So we compared these masters athletes to age-matched controls as well as healthy young adults. And here are some examples of the older adults that are quite physically active. Olga Kotelko, who was from the Vancouver area, she was a world masters athlete who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but she was a quite impressive athlete. So what we did for our first study was we looked at, or we estimated the number of motor units in masters runners. And we took a group of racers who participated in the Tele 10, which is a 10-mile race back in my home province of Newfoundland. And we only took the runners that could finish this race in less than 90 minutes. And when we compared these older adults to young adults, so here on this figure, we have the number of motor units on the y-axis, and then in the black is our young, and our dark gray is the masters athletes. The masters athletes actually had similar numbers of motor units compared to the young, and they had more motor units than their age-matched controls. So that's interesting. Someone who is active all their lives, maintain high intensity, they're able to maintain these motor units. And these were 65 years of age. Now, one of my colleagues moved these studies into world-class athletes. So what do world-class athletes in their 80s or 80 years of age look like? And what happens, we see from our previous study that young adults have about 150 motor units. And then in the 80-year-olds, the masters athletes, they have a decrease in motor units, but what happens is they maintain the number of motor units similar to those of a 65-year-old. So even though they have a decrease in motor units, their motor units stay the same to about those who are in their 60s. And they don't look like people in their 80s. So if we look at the age-matched controls, which is the dark gray box here, there's a big difference in the number of motor units for the masters athletes and the age-matched controls. And because the masters athletes maintain their numbers of motor units, they also have greater strength. So the masters athletes on the left here of the strength figure and age-matched controls on the right, there's larger strength in the masters athletes than the age-matched controls. Now you're probably asking, what does this have to do with balance? Well, strength and power and the neuromuscular system may be very influential in maintaining balance control. And the reason why I'm interested in balance and aging is, as I said earlier, those greater than 65, it's the fastest growing age group in Canada. And approximately 1/3 of older adults above the age of 65 fall each year. And the costs or healthcare costs associated with these falls is quite remarkable. And to date, there's little known about the basic mechanisms of adult aging and postural control. So that's where a lot of my studies are focusing on now is what are these basic mechanisms that control balance, and how can we manipulate them to maintain good balance into old age. So balance control is quite complicated. It may seem quite simple as we're just standing here or as you're standing talking to a friend, but there are a lot of background activity going on in order for us to stand. So as this person here on the left is standing, they use their neuromuscular system, so the box that I've outlined here now, they use their brain and muscles to produce the amount of force needed to stand. But we also rely on our sensory system. So we rely on vision. We also rely on cutaneous information or skin information that is at the bottom of our feet, so we can sense the loads that we are producing or the forces that we are producing, as well as we have these senses within our head called the vestibular system that allows us to know where our head is in space. So we have these 3D accelerometers that sense the movements of our head to allow us to maintain balance. And the vestibular system has 3 functions. So it's these organs within the back of our head. They act as accelerometers, and they have functions to control head stabilization as well as eye stabilization, so that when you're moving or your head's moving, you can still stabilize your gaze on what you are reading. As well, the vestibular system gives us an awareness of where our body is moving, how our body is moving. And finally, my major interest is that it's important for postural control. So we can manipulate the vestibular system by sending small electrical currents. So what we do is we apply electrical stimulation or very small electrical currents across the back of the head. And what happens is that we can activate the vestibular system artificially to perturb a person's balance control and determine how the vestibular system is important for balance or how it modulates balance. So what I have here now is I have a vestibular evoked balance response. So the electrical signal that I was talking about is sent through the back of the head, and we can record the muscle output as well as the forces that the person is producing. And the figure in the middle of the slide, so the little waveform, the waveform here. Sorry,
No, Brian, I don't think you've lost us, but
did I lose everyone?
Your screen went funny. And just go to share your screen again, and then maybe move down to the slide you were at.
Yeah, I think I may have clicked on something. Sorry.
Okay, there you go.
Sorry about that. I was trying to get fancy and I ruined everything. Okay, so what we have here, so if we look at the figure in the middle of our screen, it's this little biphasic response. So it goes down and then up. The gray waveform or the gray line are the older adults, and the black is the young adults. And what I want to focus on is the blue circle here. And what seems to happen is that when older adults encounter a movement or perturbation, so let's say they trip, they have larger responses, larger relative responses than young adults. So what happens is their neuromuscular system responds to a greater extent, or adults that are in their 70s and 80s, they have an overcompensation to a balance perturbation such as a trip. So because of that, this may encounter more perturbations because of the overreaction, which may lead to a fall. And again, we've shown this in healthy older adults. We also show this in healthy females as well as healthy males. So the previous slide was from older males. This slide is from older females. And again, the similar response. So we have the waveform, the black being the young adults and the gray being the older adults. We see if we look on this response called ML, that the older adults respond to a greater extent than the young, meaning that they overcompensate. And more interesting is that those that overcompensate, it's related or negatively related to their strength or power. So what happens is that those adults that are weaker, they have larger overreactions to perturbations such as head perturbations, or if they were tripped, they would have these larger perturbations. So what's happening is your nervous system is trying to compensate for the weakness of the person. So a weaker person or a less powerful person will have larger overreactions of this reflex to control their balance. So what we need to do then is possibly induce or increase our power so that we don't get these overcorrective responses. So in summary of what I talked about today is sarcopenia is a critical aspect of aging. It's multifactorial, but it is inevitable. However, we might be able to delay this through lifelong activity, or at least we start and having training to maintain, or high intensity training to be able to maintain or prevent or hold off sarcopenia as long as possible. I also talked about motor units are an important factor, and they try to compensate to maintain function, but they are one of the rate limiting factors that causes sarcopenia. Also, the loss of motor units is not the same for all individuals or all muscles. And this is likely based on activity levels. So those who are habitually active, they're able to maintain their motor units better than others who are inactive. As well, older adults have larger balance responses. So when someone is balancing and they trip, for example, while they're walking, they will have a larger balance response than a young person. And this may be due to our central nervous system trying to compensate for weakness of the peripheral muscles. So your central nervous system knows that the muscles are weaker, so it's overcorrecting or sending an overcorrective signal to a trip or a perturbation. So what we need to do is try to maintain that strength and maintain power so that we can have lower corrective responses so that we're not overcorrecting our balance control. And I thought I'd end with this quote from Cicero back in the 43 BC. It is our duty, my young friends, to resist old age. And this is a good quote for advertising physical activity. To fight against it as we would fight against disease, to adopt regimen of health. So even back in 43 BC, we were promoting health and to practice moderate exercise. So exercise is important, and it may also be important to help with our balance control, not just to strengthen power of our muscles, but also for balance control. And on that note, I'd like to thank the people who helped me with this research, as well as my lab. So there's a picture here of the lab. There's also a picture here of one of our older subjects who's standing on top of an Olympic podium. And yeah, I'd like to thank Joan for inviting me to
Thank you
give
very
this
much,
talk, and
Brian.
I'd
That was
like to
fabulous.
thank everyone for coming out
I
and
would
listening to
encourage
me
people
despite
online
everything going
to
on right now.
add your
So thank
comments
you.
or questions to
And
the
I'm
chat
happy to
box,
answer questions.
and we'll ask Brian to respond to those. So please go ahead and do that. Maybe just to get us started, Brian, um, of course, many of us are interested in your talk because we're all aging. Some of us are at more advanced ages than others, but none of us, well, I'm speaking for myself, uh, I can hardly compare myself to one of those master athletes. But on the other hand, um, maybe I need to do better at increasing strength and power. So, what would be the best advice to increase strength and power to, I guess, to reduce this large balance response that you're talking about?
Um, well, that's a good question, Joan. So one is you need to stay within your limits. So for these masters athletes, a high intensity task is going to be different than, let's say, a person who's been sedentary most of their lives, or just recreationally walks around the block. So what we need to do is work within your capacity to improve your capacity and slowly progress. So you need to work at what your body is used to being the capacity. So slowly progressing outside the box. So if you are walking slowly, then that means walking a bit brisker for a few more seconds, or walking a more brisker for a minute or so, and then moving on from there. As well as weight training, resistance training is very good for increasing strength and power. And again, progression is key. It's progressing within your capacity. The other factor is to maintain these motor units. It's being habitually active with that as well. So we need to be consistent and continually do that. So those would be some good guidelines. I'm not a personal trainer by any means, but those would be
Great,
some
thanks. So
guidelines that I
if
would
a
suggest
person
to
hasn't been
try
doing
to
that,
increase
can you
power and
actually,
strength, as
as
well
an
as
older
help
adult, build
maintain
up
healthy
strength and
function of your
power, or
neuromuscular
is this
system.
exercise, resistance training just to maintain and not lose any more than what you have already?
So yes, I'm going to say no and yes. So one is for your nerves. You can't increase the number of nerves you have within the spinal cord. So you can maintain those, but the muscle is very adaptable. So what happens is, if you train the muscles, you train your nerves in old age. So if you haven't been active, you can still maintain what you have. So you can maintain the nerves. If you're doing this habitual activity, you can help the healthy effects on the nerves, but at the same time, your muscles are quite adaptable. So you can increase your strength and power if you
So never
start
too late to
a
start
strength or
then.
power training regimen, and you can
Great.
increase or
That's good
improve
news.
your strength and power because the
Um,
muscles are
I
quite
don't see any
adaptable,
questions
even
or
into
comments on the
old
chat
age.
box, but again, encourage people who might have a comment or question.
It is not.
To chime in. Oh, okay, all right. Oh, I'm not seeing them. Oh, I haven't scrolled down. Sorry. Go ahead and try and answer those.
So I can see a couple of questions here, Joan. Okay. So Andrea asks, how does the health of the feet affect balance system in patients with neuropathy and impaired sensation? So the answer is it does affect balance control. So if we look at diabetic neuropathy, for example, those patients or those participants who have impaired sensation at their feet, they will sway more. So you're not receiving that sensory information anymore. And they have to think about how they're performing balance to maintain their balance control. And that's some of the work that we're doing now. We're interested in looking at how sensations from our feet, as well as other sensory systems, can be manipulated to help perform or help us balance better. And there are factors, or there are products out there that help with these sensations. So people with neuropathies, there are vibrating insoles, for example, that will help improve their balance control, or at least improve their sensations because of their neuropathy. Another question here is, does it matter what type of exercise we do? For the number of motor units, yes. So we've looked at runners, and we see that at least those runners involved in high intensity activity and habitual activity, so chronic activity, they're able to maintain the number of motor units. However, there's other groups. There's a group in Europe that looks at this, and they would suggest that masters athletes that perform in other recreational activities, they don't maintain the numbers of motor units as well, but they're able to maintain the strength and power of their muscles. So it does depend on what type of exercise you do, but there are benefits with all exercise and all activities. Another question here, one's from Alana. Do we know which muscles are most important to strengthen the core muscles versus more peripheral, like the quadriceps? I hesitate to answer which muscles are more important, because that's not my area of research of focusing on strength training for individual muscles. But you likely need to increase your strength and power for a majority of the muscles that are important for functional tasks. So whether it's walking or carrying groceries, and your core muscles, by core muscles meaning that your abdomen as well as your lower back muscles, and then they need to be strengthened as well, and they need to maintain muscular endurance, as well as your limb muscles, so your arm muscles as well as your leg muscles, such as your quadriceps, also need to be they also need to be exercised and trained to maintain function. The knee extensors as well as the plantar flexors are definitely correlated. Their strength and power are correlated with functional independent. So your ability to perform functional tasks like climbing stairs relates to how strong or powerful your leg muscles are. And then another question, sorry, from Alana again is there greater balance falls reduction focusing on strength versus proprioception versus vestibular? I'm unaware if one is better than the other. I think we need to start focusing on systematic as well as clinical trials to try to figure out which training is best to improve our balance control. Other question is, can you comment on activities like Tai Chi? So activities like Tai Chi, yoga, as well as dance are quite good for balance control. It's been shown that activities like yoga and Tai Chi are quite good for older adults and their ability to perform functional tasks. There are exercise programs out there focusing on balance control, such as Tai Chi, which would definitely help with balance control. And it seems that those who are dancers or people who perform yoga are more comfortable with balancing, so they don't overreact to postural perturbations when they trip or fall because they're
Brian.
more in
Great
tune, quotation
questions as
marks,
well.
with how their
And
body
I
is
see our time
balancing.
is nearly up. So I think this might be a good time to close. I want to first begin by thanking you very much for helping us today with this webinar and contributing another event to our Embrace Aging series this month in March. And also I want to thank all the participants who joined us today online. Given our unusual circumstances, we're really delighted that we were able to do this with you today. The recording will be put up on our Institute website, and you'll also be invited to participate in an evaluation by email. And so stay tuned for those contacts from us. And we hope that you'll join us for another event in the future. So thank you once again, Brian, and stay safe and healthy, everyone. Thanks again. Bye-bye.